In this demo of Brinqa, we're going to be focusing on four main areas of the Brinqa environment. First, we have our centralization of various different data sources that cover a wide variety of context. First, we have more of our primary set of data. These are going to be our vulnerability scanning solutions, any application security tools, also environments like cloud security alerts and monitoring, and even container environments as well. And a lot of times, what we get from these sources is a really good description of the risk or the vulnerabilities themselves that are being scanned and discovered, but more of a basic understanding of the asset and how it fits into the organization. So that brings us to our second category here, where really we're looking for more of the business context for these assets. We're looking at application inventory systems or CMDBs, and really starting to understand how these assets are used throughout the organization, which assets are more critical or less critical based on data sensitivity or the various business applications that they help support. And also looking at ownership context, being able to work with directories and bring in context around asset ownership or who the remediation team is for various assets. This is all very powerful information that we can use later on when we talk about automation as well. The third category is threat intel feeds, and we integrate with a wide variety of threat intel feeds to really bring further enrichment context to the vulnerabilities themselves. Now we can start to understand which vulnerabilities are actively being exploited, what's being talked about on social media or on the web, and use this as an additional enrichment point to understand how we should go set out and prioritize the remediation of all of these vulnerabilities and issues that are being identified. Once we have an understanding of all the additional context, we've gone through our prioritization process, then Brinqa steps into more of a automation and orchestration environment, where specifically in this demo, we'll be talking about the remediation process. But the way that Brinqa uses automation rules is we have rules that can focus on specific sets of conditions or criteria and capture vulnerabilities within that environment and be able to determine the process for how to create tickets. So setting up things such as automatic ownership assignment and setting the correct due date based on all of these rules that we configure. Once we have the end result of these automation rules, which are tickets, we do also commonly work with external ITSMs or any other issue management environments such as ServiceNow or Sharewell, Jira, and Azure DevOps. And we can use our integrations to push those tickets to these environments and do that in a bi-directional process so that any updates or changes that happen within these external environments can be synced back with Brinqa, and therefore we can provide accurate tracking on the remediation process without having any users have to log in directly to Brinqa to manage these tickets. This brings us to our last point that we'll be going over in the demo today, which is around reporting. And so as you can imagine, with all of this powerful context that we've initially brought in, as well as being able to accurately monitor the remediation process, we can create a wide variety of very powerful reports. There's a lot of reports that are offered out of the box within Brinqa, but one of the main things that we'll be focusing on in the demo is how we can take either these out-of-the-box reports or the ability to create new reports from the ground up within Brinqa. Before we get into our data sources and integration points, I want to highlight on how we use role-based access control to make sure that throughout all of Brinqa that we are focusing on presenting the correct data to various different users. So whether it's based on a user's role, we can display different dashboards or different views for users. So here we have more of a generalized security overview of the organization. However, we commonly have reports and dashboards for users who are of auditing-based roles, or if we have users who are parts of line of businesses or business unit representatives, then we can have different dashboards to accurately present data that a user of that role would be interested in. Now, in addition to changing the views for different users based on role, we can also look at how users relate to the data itself. In this case, on my business unit dashboard, I'm only displaying information around assets that are within the same business unit as the specific user. So I'm not looking at metrics that are for the entire organization. I'm not looking at metrics that are for assets that belong to other business units that I am not responsible for. This dashboard allows me to present data of just the assets and therefore vulnerabilities and all of the other risks that I am interested in due to my relationship to that data. Now let's get into how we manage the data integration process. First and foremost, we have data servers. These are connector agents that allow us to communicate with on-prem or data sources that reside in another location that is not open to the internet. These agents are very lightweight, and we only need one agent per network. If there are multiple data sources that reside within that network, we still only need one agent to communicate with that data source. Data sources themselves are what we call connectors. Now here we have a wide variety of connectors. I have over 150 different connectors at this point within Brinqa. And what we'll be looking at are some of the common categories that we interact with within our Brinqa deployments. So whether it's cloud inventory services, here I have some connectors for AWS set up, but Google Cloud and Azure are common integration points as well. Around application security, really we're focusing on the full SDLC process. So all of our various tools and scanners that are deployed, whether they're SAST, DAST, SCA, open source, or manual pen test results, all of these integration points will reside within our application security environment and allow us to gather risk from the various different stages of the SDLC process. Next, we have some more of our additional asset tools. This is where we can discover assets through tools such as Armis or Tanium to do some asset discovery. We also have strong integrations with cloud security, so not just looking specifically for vulnerabilities, but also being able to identify alerts and notifications from these cloud environments. In addition to cloud security, we also have a container security environment where common tools such as Aquasec or Twistlock and Prisma Cloud Compute are deployed within our customers' environments. Now we can start to understand risk more around the container and imaging process as well. In addition to a lot of the commercial sources that I've highlighted so far, we also have strong integrations with standard data formats. So here we'll see things like a SQL connector, allowing us to access any SQL type database, or LDAP for directories or AD. And this is where we can get a lot of additional context from either on-prem CMDB type sources or directories that help shape user information and how users relate to the assets we're discovering as well. In addition, we also have flat file format support as well. So here we see a CSV connector. I'm able to import anything that resides in an Excel format or spreadsheets and be able to use that information with ease as well. The last few categories that I'll highlight are around the ITSM process. So again, once we get into that remediation, we're able to create tickets within Brinqa, but also push these tickets out to some of our common ITSM integration points or external issue environments. Now, the last category here, in addition to our threat intel integrations, are our vulnerability management tools. This is where we'll see our common tools such as Qualys and Tenable and Rapid7, and really be able to bring in all of the network vulnerabilities that are being discovered against our various assets. In addition to the variety of connectors that we see, we also offer what we call mappings. Mappings are how we control the flow of information between these various different data sources and the Brinqa environment. So if we look at a very common integration point, I'll look at Qualys Vulnerability Management as my connector here. We'll see that I have a few different mappings. Now, what we have is a mapping for each type of record that is available from these sources. So first, we will see I have the Qualys knowledge base. This is all of the QIDs or vulnerability definitions from Qualys. Then I also have the vulnerabilities themselves. So these are the actual scan results and identified vulnerabilities. And then third and final, I have the Qualys host. These are the assets itself, giving us records of all of the hosts that are being scanned within the Qualys environment. Now, if we look at any of our mappings, what we'll see is that these are provided out of the box, ready to go, but offer us a level of configurability to really control that process more effectively. We can do that in a couple different ways. First, we have the ability to control how we determine uniqueness for each type of record. So here we have our coalesce values, and we can change which individual attribute or combination of attributes are used to determine a unique asset record within Brinqa as we're syncing from these sources. This is great for controlling and being able to deduplicate multiple sources that we're syncing with. As we bring in hosts from Qualys, in this case, we may also already have hosts from our CMDB. And instead of duplicating our efforts and having multiple records for the same asset, now we can control that coalesce process and make sure that we're aligning those records together and creating more of a single pane of glass view. The mapping process also allows to control which attributes we actually want from each particular source. So in this case, if we have operating system that's coming from our CMDB or another directory or database, we may not want to use that from Qualys. We can actually just remove that from the mapping in this case and not sync that particular attribute from the Qualys environment. Let's jump in and let's take a look at some of the sample data that we have within the demo. And we'll start to talk about our second point, which is really around the additional context and how we use that throughout Brinqa. I'll start with some of our vulnerabilities. And within our vulnerabilities, one of the first things that I think is important to highlight is that Brinqa brings in all context from these various different sources. We're not dropping any information from these sources. We are capturing the full record and providing additional context on top of that full record. So here I have a list of vulnerabilities. Each vulnerability has its own record, full level of detail and description. So I can understand things like the potential solution and the impact of the vulnerability, as well as the results field or output from the vulnerability scan, which does prove useful during the remediation process. Now, in addition to these vulnerabilities, we are, again, providing additional context. This is where we can provide risk score or a prioritization value. That prioritization value within Brinqa is an open approach. So we have a configurable risk score that allows our customers to determine which values are used within that risk score, as well as the weights that are used on those values to determine how much of an impact they have within the prioritization process. Now, of course, our score starts with best practices, but allowing this level of configurability really allows for the customers to have accurate understanding of prioritization and be able to use that prioritization to sort the remediation process and trust that whichever vulnerabilities or issues we are targeting are of the utmost importance within the environment. Now, if we take a step up and look at some of our asset records, this is really where we'll start to see a collection of everything that we've talked about and all the various different data sources coming together. On my asset page, we can already start to see that I have additional ownership and perhaps service team context for some of my assets. So these are being combined with the records that we're seeing from our various sources. And if we see across the top, I also have some common searches saved. So here I can dive into our mission critical servers. And from this list, I can select an individual record and look at that in more detail. Now, on the asset record itself, this is really where we start to see everything come together. So across the top of the page, I have more of my technical information. On the left-hand side, this is really more of my device details, name, IP, operating system. And then my second column is where I have more of my business context. So relationships to other assets. In this case, I have a application that this server is helping support. And we'll take a look at that here in just a moment as another asset example. But in addition to that, I also have context around which business service this asset is helping provide functionality for, or really serving a common goal for, as well as things like ownership context. So now I can look at the difference between an owner and a subject matter expert for that device type, as well as the service team that's actually responsible for the remediation efforts of this asset. Now, in addition to the business context around relationships, I also have risk information that I might be gathering from our CMDB sources. This is where I can define things like criticality for the asset, or perhaps any compliance criteria as well. In this case, you'll note that the host we are currently observing is requiring HIPAA compliance. This is a factor that will go into the risk score of all of the vulnerabilities and violations and issues that are discovered against this asset, and allow us to prioritize them over other assets that are not deemed as critical to the organization. Now, as we look further down this asset page, we'll start to see all of the various different related findings or discovery items against this asset. Here we have a subscription list for various products. So I have a list of products that are known to be deployed against this asset. And I can look at the assumed vulnerabilities based on which CVEs are known to be a part of those products. Below that, I can see vulnerability scan results directly. So these are more of our scanning sources, such as Qualys or Tenable and Rapid7. Really identifying vulnerabilities based on validated scan results. In addition to that, I might also have sources for external vulnerability or risk exposure. So from digital footprinting, now I can look at CVEs that are exposed or open ports that are identified from the outside. And lastly, we have policy violations. So as we discover, perhaps through policy scanning solutions, we can identify gaps within that coverage and which violations have occurred, and tag those against these assets as well as patching information. So the last table I have here is more around the patches that are available for this asset that are not yet deployed. We can see which patch priority they offer, as well as any potential risk that can be associated to those patches not being deployed as well. Let's take a look at another asset record. In this case, we'll take a look at the application that this host actually helps support. And so within this application view, we can see it's a similar layout. We have some slight changes to the asset record itself, but across the top of the page, we're really focusing on more of the asset details, whether that is the criticality in terms of how the asset supports the organization, or some of our ownership details, or any other information around the asset itself. Now, in this case, I can break down my scoring into a couple different areas or categories. First, we can see our overall risk score for the application. This is everything that affects the application rolled up into a single score. Then I have my application risk score. This is more traditionally what tools would show around application risk. And this is really focusing on the SDLC side of things. So these are the issues from our SAST results, any findings from DAST tools or manual pen testing environments, anything that's related to the coding or deployment of the application itself. My next category is my infrastructure risk score. And so as we noted on the previous server, we were supporting this application on that server deployment. And based on all of the servers that we can see here in this first table, there are multiple risk items associated to each server based on those vulnerabilities and violations that we just looked at. And so being able to aggregate all of these scores together gives us a total infrastructure risk score of this application. And lastly, I have another source as well as more of an example, but in this case, we can also have external control assessment scores. Anything that's used to identify risk of the application from more of a questionnaire type process or really any type of assessment score. And then we can use all three of these different categories to represent the overall risk score of the application as a whole. Now, if we look further down the page, again, similarly to the asset, the host that we previously looked at, we will see all of the various risk items that associate to the application as a whole. First, we have our dependencies that we talked about. These are all of our servers or databases that help support this application. Then we can have components associated to the application as well as their issues. We have issues discovered through our SAST results and any dynamic finding results, as well as our pen test results. So all of these are correlated together into a single application record. And this is what allows us to really have that finalized single pane of glass view. All of this information would typically reside in 5 or 6 different sources, but now being able to have this on a single record within Brinqa gives us much better context to the health of this application and the effect that it has on the organization. If we take a look at any of the issues themselves, we'll see that we have different layouts for each type of risk item. In this case, this is more of a static code result where we can see the details of the issue that was discovered, any recommendation details, as well as the ability to tie that issue back to a common weakness definition. This is very useful for being able to normalize risk across various different platforms as well. As you know, each scanning tool has its own way of providing severity or risk, but within Brinqa, we really want to focus on not only a more accurate risk score that takes into account the asset context, but also the ability to normalize that score across multiple environments. And so having common definitions that these issues can relate to allows us to describe that process as well as control that definition. So if we deem that cross-site scripting is more sensitive to our particular organization, then I can update just the definition, and therefore all occurrences based on this cross-site scripting definition will be affected by that change that I make for my organization. Next, we're going to talk about remediation. And we're going to take a brief look at how Brinqa controls the remediation process through what we call creation rules. And then we'll take a look at a few example tickets as well. Remediation rules are the process that allows us to define when issues or vulnerabilities meet certain conditions, how they will be ticketed within the environment automatically. So here you can see I have quite a few different rules focusing on different environments, different conditions that I want to focus on for different control enforcements. Here, if we take a look at an example rule for a vulnerability type, we can see that for this remediation rule, we're focusing on Java-related vulnerabilities that affect the Windows environment. Now, each remediation rule is really broken down into 2 main sections. First, we have our when to run section, and this is around scope and automation. So first, we can define when we actually evaluate this rule. So here, a common event for automation would be after sync with a particular data source, such as Qualys in this case, and calculations. So I have my risk score and risk rating values for prioritization. Once those complete, then I'm going to target all of the vulnerabilities that match the following conditions. Now, this is really where I can define my scope, And as we see here, I'm focusing on essentially what was described above in the description. Each vulnerability has all sets of attributes available to use for conditions. And in this case, we can see a vulnerability has a host, and a host has its own set of attributes. And we can extend that list out and be able to use those additional attributes as part of our conditions. In this case, we have selected the host operating system. And if that term contains Windows, that's our first condition. And then the other two groups that we're targeting are the software of the vulnerability that is affected is of a Java type, and the risk rating that we determined for prioritization is equal to high. Now, with those conditions set, we now have our scope for our vulnerabilities, and we can look at the ticket properties. This is how we actually define the ticket and who it's going to be assigned to and what the due date will be for each ticket that we create using this rule. Now, for assignment, we can do things like static assignment, to where in this rule, for example, we could just assign everything to a Windows team. But in this case, if you remember earlier on my example host or server, I had a service team. And we can do dynamic assignment and use some of those related fields. So in this case, we'll do assignment based on an attribute. And that attribute is going to be looking at the host that a vulnerability was discovered on and assigning it to whoever is listed as the service team for that particular host or asset. And the second part is the due date. So based on the conditions above, I'm capturing for a specific set of conditions, enforcing a certain policy, and I can put the SLA enforcement for that policy in the due date. So here, for our Java vulnerabilities that are high and affect our Windows environment, I have a 30-day due date. Now, in addition to everything that we've looked at so far, which at this point would create one-to-one tickets, so we'd have one ticket for every vulnerability, we can also look at the process for consolidating those tickets together. In this case, we can look at a very common scenario, which is grouping vulnerabilities based on the type of vulnerability that is discovered, or perhaps the type of solution that is offered, so the patch or remediation. We also have a secondary element where we're grouping them further by the service team that each individual ticket was assigned to. So now, if we have multiple occurrences of a single vulnerability, we'll no longer be creating individual tickets for each vulnerability. We will group them together based on having the same patch and also all of the vulnerabilities that we're going to be assigned to the same remediation team. So let's take a look at an example ticket. The first one that I have here will look at an example of a consolidated ticket, which is very similar to the rule that we just evaluated. And in this case, we can see in the ticket body itself, we offer the description and solution. We're collecting all of the necessary information for the remediation team to go about and actually resolve this vulnerability. But in addition to that, I also have a consolidation table towards the bottom of this ticket. This allows me to note each affected asset for this single type of vulnerability, as well as track the status of each individual vulnerability and really be able to validate the fix or remediation throughout that process. So now, as we go out and are deploying our patches, we're fixing these vulnerabilities, I can track that remediation effort and be able to identify through validated rescans with our vulnerability scanner which vulnerabilities have been remediated and which ones are still open. This allows me to track the overall completion of each individual ticket, and I can use that for further automation if I want to manage the remediation lifecycle as well. So as this ticket reaches 90% or 100%, wherever our threshold lies, I can change the status of the ticket from an open state, and I can actually close this ticket out automatically based on those validated results. Now, everything that I've highlighted here has really been within the Brinqa environment. These are the tickets that we are initially creating based on those remediation rules. But as we said earlier, we have strong integrations with our external ITSM, or issue environments. And so you'll note here that this ticket has an external ID. And this external ID allows me to look at this ticket that has been exported to an alternate environment. In this case, that ticket is residing within ServiceNow. And the ticket that was created has all the same descriptive properties. So everything that's needed for the remediation team to, again, go out and do their jobs, all of that information is provided within this ticket. Any information that changes within ServiceNow, so if I change the assignment or if I change the due date of the ticket within ServiceNow, all of those changes get pulled back into Brinqa as well. So our bidirectional process allows the ticket that Brinqa originally created to always stay up to date and in sync with the ticket that is actually being worked on within the external environment. For our last topic that I want to cover, we're going to get into more of the reporting. And if we take a look, we'll notice that there are a wide variety of reports that are provided out of the box within Brinqa. A couple things that we're going to look at are some different functionalities or features. I'll use a couple different reports to show each different feature that we want to look at. And as we do this, I'll also take a couple reports to explore how we can create or modify reports as well. So this report takes a look at our vulnerability scanning coverage and allows us to identify assets which are not being scanned within a certain period of time. And so this bar chart, for example, shows us not only how many servers have been scanned within the last 30 days or 90 days, but in this case, since I have brought in some CMDB context and now I have things like each asset's location within the organization, I can use that as a secondary dimension to break that data apart and understand topics like scan coverage, is that an issue that exists throughout the entire organization? Or is that something that can be narrowed down to a specific team or location in this point, and really understand where the fix for that issue lies? On the left-hand side, we'll see a couple different callouts for certain types of assets or counts. So if we look here, we'll see how many servers have not been scanned for 120 days. This is great to have that value and be able to understand that there are 27 assets that meet that description. But we can interact with any of our reports as well. And so simply clicking on that particular visual takes me to a list of assets that meet that condition. So this is where I can get to the list of assets that have not been recently scanned. And I can actually download this list as well. So if I want to export this data from Brinqa, perhaps get it into a spreadsheet format, then I can do that right here within this list page. Another report that I have focuses on a particular value that we are tracking. We have what we call compliance state, which allows us to define the SLA period throughout the organization and take that context and apply that to all vulnerabilities and issues that have been discovered. So based on the prioritization value for each vulnerability or application issue, we can track the overall compliance based on how long it has been open without remediation. And based on ownership details of each individual asset, now we can take all of those counts of those vulnerabilities and we can break those apart and start to show the overall compliance percentage, in this case, by director. We can put them onto a single metric, so this can help gamify the situation and help bring visibility to how various report members are comparing against each other. And then we can take a look at more of the individual metrics as well. So if we need that more rich detail, understanding of the actual counts of vulnerabilities, then we can break that detail down as well. All right. Another report that I have here really focuses on the combination of information from various different sources. So as we've talked about so far, within my environment, right, I definitely have a focus on the infrastructure vulnerabilities, but also within the application environment, we're looking at things like our static code results and our dynamic findings. And so from more of a business application perspective, I can correlate all of this data together and really start to understand on a single report where my top risk is coming from, whether it's from infrastructure or our static code results, or if we need to look at trending information as well, we can understand how many issues have been discovered on a weekly or monthly basis over time. Now, our reports also support inputs. So in this example, while we may focus on all of the applications within the environment, we can focus and get into a specific set. So if I want to look at just applications that meet my confidential data classification, then I can select that input on the report, and everything is now changed to focus on just those subset of applications. So this allows me to define or create a report once and then look at that report from multiple different perspectives, being able to filter into a specific team if I want to look at a team's report, or how things look for just one particular business unit, or in this case, all applications that meet certain criteria like data classification. The last report that we will take a look at, I'll use to show how we actually build reports and what the report building environment looks like within Brinqa. Now, this report shows a good variety of different report visualizations. So across the top, we have our single counts, great for actually counting values or showing maximum or minimum values. I also have gauges and trending information. Trending information is actually based on historical values within Brinqa. So this allows me to identify how many, or in this case, what our average risk score was over time, in this case, week over week. So I can look at historical values in Brinqa and be able to understand that trend of that score. I also have charts and graphs to show distribution information and help break down our understanding of risk. And in this case, also highlight the differences between the severity of vulnerabilities from their originating source compared to the Brinqa risk score, which is taking into account more of the business context and prioritizing based on the actual impact to the organization. Now, on this report, if we look at the top right, we'll notice that we have the ability to edit this report. Now, we can also create new reports, and everything is presented in the same visual environment here. But each report and really all views throughout Brinqa are managed with this particular interface. This allows us to drag and drop to rearrange how we want to organize our reports. Everything is split into different rows, and rows have individual columns. And then once we have the format of the report that we're going for, we can choose from a number of different visualization styles on how we actually want to present the metrics that we will be collecting here. So in this case, let's choose an example that we already have. Let's look at a bar chart that has a distribution of vulnerabilities. And in this case, we can see if we look at the edit of this particular report, we'll see all the different metrics that went into collecting this visual. So we have a couple different points. First is our data model. This particular metric is focused on our vulnerability set of data. And inside that, I have some sort of primary measure or function. In this case, I'm choosing count, but Brinqa offers a variety of functions to be able to use. So averages, min-max values, percentages, or even unique values as well. But in this case, we just want to know the number of vulnerabilities. So we can choose count, and then we can use a couple different dimensions in order to break that count apart and better understand. So in this case, I'm looking at each vulnerability and the host that it was discovered on and which business service that host is associated to. So now I'm looking at a distribution of my vulnerabilities throughout our various different business services. And then within inside those business services, I'm breaking it apart again to understand the different prioritization values. So I have risk score as my second dimension, which allows me to look at how many vulnerabilities are minimal, low, medium, high, or critical within inside each business service. So that same interface is used to create all the different metrics that we see here. And with inside that, we can also control more of the visual elements as well. So I can change the actual representation. I can get rid of stacking so I can see the counts side by side. And then there are further enhancements that we can do to control things like the colors that are used, as well as the axis format and everything else about the visuals. Okay. So I'll leave us with one more example report. This report I'll use to show more of a story-driven approach to reporting. As we can see here, we're really looking more at an overall executive dashboard where we can have different risk scores based on the various environments that exist within the organization. And while it's nice to have very high-level, easy-to-interpret scores, sometimes we need access to more of the data behind those scores. And so every visual supports this drill down ability to where we can be taken to different reports that show more context around that particular scope. In this case, I clicked on the PCI gauge, and now we can see I'm brought to a report that specifically focuses on the overall risk and distribution for just the PCI group of assets. So now I can see my top 10 hosts. If I need to look at the risk score distribution for my PCI infrastructure, then I can do that, as well as some more of the trending information over time. So drill downs within reports allow us to interact with different elements and take us to perhaps more descriptive reports or also list pages of individual vulnerabilities or applications or issues based on what we are clicking on and where we have it taking us.